Africa's private equity landscape is proving more and more attractive. Competition is rising on several fronts. First-time entrants are circling the region looking for assets, while fundraisers are hoping to bring some $12 billion to the continent. Joining us now from Cape Town is Rory Ord. He's the head of RisCura Fundamentals, and he was discussing venture capital at the Cape Town Africa Investment Conference earlier today. Rory, thank you so much for joining us. Indications are that there's a growing competitiveness for private equity projects in Africa. This is, of course, a far cry, from when investors were simply waiting for projects of interest. What do you think is driving this competitiveness in Africa?
Well, I think for the first time we're seeing people interested in Africa from all over the world. There have been a number of reports in recent years come through talking about Africa's amazing growth story. We hear statistics that 6 or 7 of the fastest 10 growing economies in the world will be in Africa over the next few years, which is all sort of building the African growth story. And for the first time, we're seeing money come from the US, from all over Europe, and interest from Asia, of course, into the African continent. Added to that, we have the scenario where our listed markets are in some ways limited. They've developed quite well over the last few years, but if investors really want to get access to a fuller African picture, then they have to start looking into private equity markets. What this has meant is that we've seen private equity in Africa grow to around $25 to $30 billion, half of which is still in South Africa, but it's shown very promising growth over the last few years.
Mm-hmm. Now, you were saying the half of it is in South Africa. Obviously, East Africa, Kenya is an interesting destination for private equity. Take us through what other kind of regional opportunities besides South Africa is beginning to open up, and where are investors looking? Is it East Africa? Are they going to Nigeria? Where else except South Africa are people interested in?
Well, in many ways, the proposition in the rest of Africa is much more attractive to South Africa these days. We have the situation in South Africa where we have fairly low growth, fairly developed markets, and a fairly well-developed private equity industry as well. In the rest of Africa, particularly in West Africa, there's a very strong growth story that's happening. We're seeing strong macroeconomic trends, which are seeing investment in things like telecoms, consumer goods, even into agriculture and banking and insurance products. So that's a very strong theme across different geographies, including both West and East Africa, as you say. What we're seeing is that in West Africa, clearly the resources story is still very strong, but private equity doesn't tend to invest in resources. What they do invest in is services that go alongside resources. The mining story or the extractive industries are really too capital intensive and too much of a long time horizon for private equity to be invested in those type of industries. So we're seeing things like white goods, telecommunications products, and also infrastructure as well. There's a fair amount of private equity investment that goes into infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. Now, with FDI having fallen by huge percentages after the recent global financial meltdown, how important is private equity as a vehicle for investment in Africa?
One of the real strengths of private equity is that it's a long-term asset class. So we see investors commit for generally a 10-year period. So what that means is through periods of crisis or stress in economic markets, the private equity capital stays consistent through that time, and we don't see large swings, as investors can't simply pull out their money from economies as they're invested into private companies which can't be liquidated. So that's quite a strength for private equity in that it benefits the actual companies receiving the money, and they know that stability is there on the investor's side.
Mm-hmm. Now, we spoke earlier about West Africa. Let's look at East Africa. It's fast positioning itself as a destination for private equity. What is making East Africa more attractive than, let's say, South Africa with its mature liquid financial service sector?
Well, what East Africa has on its side is quite similar to a number of other African markets, in that we have strong growth in these African economies. We have growth around the 6-7% mark, GDP growth per annum. We have strongly urbanizing populations. We have improving levels of disposable income, which allows private equity investors to go into consumer-facing businesses and make good money. And we've seen quite strong returns come through across the continent just from investing in these types of businesses.
Now, 20 years ago, telecoms was a key driver. What other sectors are making strides in this regard?
Well, telecoms is still an important story, but we've seen the game change a little bit. In previous years, there was a lot of investment into cell phone service providers. What we're seeing now is a large amount of investment go into cell phone towers companies, which are still growing very strongly across many different African markets, and a number of African private equity players are interested in buying into that market. Consumer goods. The consumer story is one of the biggest stories that we're seeing in Africa. There's a very strong changing demographic of the African population. People are moving to the cities very strongly. Incomes are improving, which finally is allowing the African consumer to have money in their pocket and start to afford some of the goods that are more common in Western markets. And all of those sort of trends play into the African private equity story and allow investment and some certainty and growth prospects in those different markets.
Just shortly, quickly, what is the outlook going forward, particularly against the background of this rising African middle class?
Well, frankly, we expect more of the same. All the forecasts that we see around Africa are of strong growth, and some of the key factors behind that are the relative political stability that we've seen, relative peacefulness of different African economies, a lot of reform in institutional markets. So there's been a lot of pension fund reform across Africa, which has increased the amount of money in systems and the development of African capital markets. So all of those trends are going to give us improved markets, improved flows of money into these economies from around the world, and increased growth.